Anime killed cartoons, but not in a bad way, not in a way that you kind of expected it to happen. Anime has kind of been the king of animation style, shows for the past, I would say, 10 years even. Now, while it's not the longest time, it's a noticeable time to kind of see that cartoons have kind of taken a backseat to anime over the past 10 years. But before we get into all those reasons, let's just kind of go back in time and see how king cartoons were over anime, despite their immense popularity. Now, if we all being honest here, for the past 3-4 decades, the main channels that we've all watched cartoons from have been Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon. The Nickelodeon to an earlier example because they were founded around the 70s, and Cartoon Network around the early 90s. And they both kind of had their peaks and falls and highs and lows around the same time. And I don't think that that's all a coincidence. Now, if you ask anybody, especially around my age, around mid 20s, late 20s, early 30s, they'll all tell you that the golden age of cartoons was the 90s and the 2000s, which I agree with, and the early 2010s to a certain extent. But we all remember those days and we remember them fondly. And those were kind of the peak cartoon decades, because before then, cartoons were just seen as, a thing for kids during the morning time that only lasted a couple of hours from around 7 to 10. And then there would be adult shows on every other network. There wasn't a set network for cartoons until Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon came along. Now, I'm not mentioning Disney Channel because Disney Channel isn't really cartoon based mainly. Especially cartoon shows, mainly what I'm talking about. They're mainly dealt in movies. So I'm gonna just keep it with Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon just to keep it simple. But like I said before, Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon were the main destination channels that you would go to actually watch cartoons and to watch them all day. And these cartoon channels would take off way more than I think anybody would ever expected them to, and amassing so much success that nobody really could compete with them at a certain point in time. Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon were some of the most popular channels on cable throughout the 90s and the 2000s. But a little channel would come along around that same time which would change the landscape of what cartoons and anime would. A little network that you might have heard of in the early 2000s, 4Kids TV launched in 2002. And with 4Kids being a thing, this brought stuff like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Naruto, and One Piece. Now, in hindsight, this might not seem that crazy, but back then, this one network introduced a whole new media to a whole new generation of kids that had never even heard of anime before. Because most of the time, if you heard of anime, majority of the time you either read it in a manga or somehow found a website that was able to stream it, which was not common back in the day. And with 4Kids being the absolute success that it was, which nobody saw coming, they saw fast results but at a slower pace than you kind of would have imagined. Anime content would not only begin to boom, it would become one of the most popular animation styles in America, which only made anime in the West become bigger and bigger. But cartoons still remain king as far as animation went. For all of the 2000s, cartoons would still be the main way that kids consume animation. And not just kids, but everybody in general, but it would be the main way that people would consume animation style content. While anime was on the rise of things like Pokemon, Dragon Ball Z, Naruto, and One Piece, and so on and so forth, it still wasn't enough to overcome cartoons, which had been the king of animation, and this was expected. And to kind of go back on what I meant by fast but slow results, if you didn't watch anime, you didn't really see much of a change in the first part when anime really started to boom. Cartoons were still coming out at a fast pace and they were still of good quality at the time. And nothing really changed, especially with cartoon movies, cartoon shows. You didn't really notice a difference in how shows were being made or how shows were styled or drawn. You didn't really notice a difference at first. Even though anime saw huge success and was even winning awards around this time, it wasn't enough to necessarily shift the entire, space of animation completely towards anime, because anime was still this brand new thing as far as American audiences went, which for most shows, which was their main and biggest audience. Now, I've already made videos on both Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network. Y'all can go check them out at your own time. So I won't really go into too much of a rant about Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon, but to give them as much credit as I can, through the 2000s and the 90s, they were the kings of cartoons. And this was undisputed. You were either watching Cartoon Network or Nickelodeon if you were watching cartoons. Cartoon Network was pumping out cartoons at a good pace, they're of good quality, and there were really no complaints as far as Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon went throughout the 90s and the 2000s. So the anime boom didn't really do anything to them. If anything, they kind of took it as, oh, this is just another form of cartoon, basically. Most networks didn't really take it seriously at first. And this, in my opinion, was actually a great thing because they didn't feel, forced to try to, change their style of animation or cartoon quality just because a new form of cartoons came out, basically. And around this time, Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon actually had more diversity than they ever had as far as cartoons went. Cartoon Network had their mainline cartoons, which were their most viewed shows like Ed, Edd, and Eddy and Kids Next Door. And Nickelodeon had, SpongeBob, Chalk Zone, and they even had, the cartoons, which were, for smaller cartoons to kind of, get a spotlight and be shown and then end up on the main channel. And they really were, as far as cartoons went, the most diverse that they had ever been. And it was really good for the network and the show and for the people watching, because we weren't just watching the same thing over and over and over again. Now, Teen Titans and Avatar: The Last Airbender are two shows in particular that I want to focus on for this section of the video, because in my humblest of opinions, these were the two shows that turned the tides for anime and cartoons. Because before then, cartoons and anime didn't necessarily, now these didn't have an immediate impact, but they had a slow, long-lasting impact as to where anime and cartoons kind of became merged more and more as time went on. Because Teen Titans and Avatar: The Last Airbender, from my understanding, are some of the most popular cartoon/anime shows of all time. Especially Avatar: The Last Airbender, as people have always had debates as to whether it's an anime or it's a cartoon, because they fuse the two so well together. And these two shows sort of created a shift in how people saw anime and cartoons. Now people didn't look at anime as something that, oh, you watched when you were an older kid or when you were a teenager. And people didn't look at cartoons as, oh, you only watched that as a kid, because of how well shows like this. Now, while there were other shows who did kind of have this same, because around the time of Avatar: The Last Airbender and Teen Titans both being on TV, and Avatar: The Last Airbender being on Nickelodeon and Teen Titans being on Cartoon Network, this was around the time that anime started to blend in with cartoons. And stuff like Naruto would be shown on, Cartoon Network during the daytime, and then Toonami coming back and start showing anime again. Anime became blended in with cartoons as one thing and not two separate things like they were before. And this sort of shift allowed for more creativity as far as what could be done with cartoons and what could be done with anime. It's not just, oh, cartoons have to be this one way or anime has to be this certain way. They could be whatever you imagine them to be, and it didn't have to fit into this one box like they did beforehand. And again, specifically, this is, no pun intended, where some of these shows lost the plot. Around the time that Avatar: The Last Airbender ended, Teen Titans had long ended, and I wish it would have had its conclusive ending. But this was around the time that cartoons started to fall off a bit. And by a bit, I mean a lot. Especially in certain cases, if you look at stuff like Nickelodeon. Nickelodeon did not have any recovery after Avatar: The Last Airbender. After Avatar: The Last Airbender ended on Nickelodeon, the only thing Nickelodeon had to present to people as far as cartoons was SpongeBob. And it was only SpongeBob, and there was nothing else that they even really wanted to present to us. Cartoon Network around this time was still holding on, but by a fucking thread. And by that, I'm pretty sure we all remember, especially because I covered this in my video, Cartoon Network only had a couple more good years in them, honestly. It was only a couple of cartoons that were keeping Cartoon Network above ground, like, Chowder and Adventure Time, which lasted almost 10 years in its own right. But beyond that, Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon, they had nothing left. They ran out of steam. And not even mentioning Disney Channel because they ran out of steam long before both Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon. So it's not even worth mentioning them. But like I said, they both ran out of steam and they didn't have anything left. And this was the prime time for anime to take over as the main, animation stuff that people watched. And take over they fucking. And also on top of that, I kind of want to get on this other topic of around this time, finding cartoons was not as easy as it was years ago, but finding anime only became easier and easier. With Cartoon Network's main shows being shitty, and so as far as Disney Channel went, they both resorted to relying on anime. With Cartoon Network bringing back Toonami for like the third fucking time at this point, and Disney Channel even showing Naruto Shippuden on fucking Disney XD, they both at this point were relying on anime to keep them afloat. Because cartoons just became more scarce and more scarce over time, and you couldn't find any cartoons that were worth watching. Because around the late 2010s, the only cartoons that were worth watching on Cartoon Network at least were Regular Show and Adventure Time. But after those two shows went off, it was basically nothing left to watch until nighttime when Toonami came on with Naruto, Dragon Ball Z, Kai, and even on occasions them rerunning old animes from the 90s and early 2000s. Also, one thing that cartoons heavily relied on was cable, and the death of cable only helped the rise of anime become even easier. Because with the rise of stuff like Netflix, Hulu, Crunchyroll, and Funimation, and all these other streaming apps, which some of them even created their own anime, and every anime you possibly could think of being on these streaming services, and the main company, which basically owns all of these animes, having its own streaming service, it was only a matter of time at that point. And with all these different and unique ways to watch anime, there were no ways to watch cartoons anymore. The after effects of this have basically killed cartoons, with cartoons becoming more and more scarce over the years and anime becoming more and more prevalent, and about 100 ways to watch anime, whether you still watch it on cable or whether you got like the 20 streaming services which also stream anime. There's basically no way to watch cartoons but every way to watch anime. Now, is this necessarily a bad thing? I don't know, but it's not necessarily a good thing either, because just having cartoons basically be dead like this isn't really a good thing, because I feel like having cartoons and anime was like the happy medium of, if you don't want to watch some like Bleach or like Chainsaw Man, or like Demon Slayer, or something like that, you kind of could pivot to watching something like Chowder or Adventure Time or Regular Show, something which is more chill and more not so serious all the time. Not saying anime could be serious all the time, but something that you don't really have to pay attention to, something that you can just sit back and chill to. But I don't really know how they fix this, because I don't really see cartoons making a comeback, at least in recent years. But who fucking knows? We might be on the cusp of a cartoon renaissance or some shit. I don't know. It's just my opinion.